and we can start the second part of this webinar, which is co-organized by ETUI, the Research Institute of the Trade Unions in Brussels, and FEPS, the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, of which I'm the Secretary General. My name is László, and I would like to welcome my three panelists, starting with Shada Islam, who is a director at Friends of Europe, Philippe Pochet, who is the head of the ETUI, the co-organizer of this event, and Lodewijk Asscher, who is the leader of the Dutch Labour Party, former minister. And in introduction, I would like to highlight that all three panelists have written something very important and very interesting recently, which we recommended to everybody who joins this meeting. Lodewijk Asscher published an essay, which in English is titled Rebuilding After the Corona Crisis. Of course, originally it was published in Dutch, but FEPS published then it in English. Philippe Pochet published 4 scenarios for Europe's future after the crisis on the Social Europe website. And Shada Islam published actually 3 scenarios for a COVID-19 world with the subtitle, We Can Still Make the Right Choices. And that was published on the Friends of Europe website. So we have a lot of food for thought. And for the introduction, to be honest, I have nothing else but asking the panelists to stay still a little bit for the family photo. We start with the photo in this case. Perhaps a decent smile would be okay. 1, 2, 3. And hopefully my colleagues managed to catch the spirit of the moment. With this offer. Now, as compared to the first part of this meeting, we would like to distance ourselves from the mechanics of the crisis response. The previous panel, distinguished economists, together with Paul Magnette, discussed the European Commission's recovery strategy and the budgetary instruments that were put on the table just last week. We would need to look ahead and discuss, as we said, scenarios, but various aspects of the possible scenarios, starting with what I would call the behavioral aspects, the everyday life, because this is what most people experience first of all. How our everyday life, from grocery shopping to schooling, has changed in the recent 2 or 3 months. And we can probably assume that just like in previous major crises, there are some elements with this new everyday life which will stay with us. And there might be other elements which can go away, or we can get rid of them. Maybe this would be the first round of the question. How the panelists understand these behavioral changes, what is likely to stick, or where can we bounce back to our original lifestyle. Lodewijk, would you like to start?
Well, I think the everyday lifestyle will be changed in a way that some sort of social distancing will remain. Because it's not so bad after all, and everybody is quite afraid of these pandemics from now on. I think we've learned our lesson. I think for most people, the biggest way their life is affected if they did not get COVID is that part of our economy has come to a full and complete stop. So people who were just working happily up until March 16, at least that was the case in the Netherlands, are now out of a job and out of income and with no real perspective. So their big question is, will things return to normal anytime soon?
Okay, Philippe Pochet, what is your opinion about the same?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question, and I would like to have 3 dimensions. The first is about the space, organization of space and geography. The second is around time, and the last around value and identity. And the first is the most obvious, is the space. You go in the street and you see directly that something has changed. The space between the people in the kind of individual space, when you feel that someone is entering in your space, is completely different now that it was 3 months ago. And that's at the individual level, but the same at the more collective level, at the working place. I think it's the end of the open space, for example, as a concept for working together, but also all the discussion about the telework and how we will organize our life differently from home that previously. And when you go a step further, you have the city, and you see the city are changing. That's Amsterdam, that's Brussels, Paris. We will have cities that have to reinvent or we will circulate in the city. And it's not only that you will have perhaps more bike, but also the collective transport will be different. So the city will be different. Another level is the borders. When we consider that the other are, and I think that crisis is really interesting because we consider the other European and we fragmented the space in Europe. But it's not only in Europe, because in Europe it's obvious, but it's also in Australia. When you had the Queensland deciding that there is a border with the South Wales in all federal states, is the same in India. So this question, where is the other, will I think also affect. And finally, the question of globalization and deglobalization. So I think for the future, from the kind of personal experience, what will be interesting is to see with geographer, perhaps, how the world will rearrange from me to the global and the global region. The second is the time and timing, because, and there I have my doubt, because I don't know in which direction it will go. So in a way, we were over-connected, trying to spend all the day with all the Zoom teams and other devices. In the same time, we had this kind of paradoxal injunction that we should do yoga and think about ourselves and regain our autonomy and have the freedom to decide what to do when we were in our apartment. And I think that will have a huge impact. We will accelerate the timing that we had, or we will decelerate and we will have slowdown. And that's, I think, important question. And for that, I have no idea in which direction. And finally, and I stop with that, is value and identity. And that's important because our value identity was very often about what we consume and what we can buy and what we can show to the others. Okay, look, I'm different because I have a bigger car, bigger house, more clothes, etc. And so with this crisis, is the value to consume and to continue to consume and more will continue, or we will have people thinking about what is important and not important to have. And once again, it's not very clear. It could go in different directions, but it seems that when we had some experience from the stopping the lockdown, the people are not returning to this kind of crazy consumption. Perhaps it will be in 6 months, but for the moment, it's not the case. And that's as important economic impact and as important impact about the value, or you consider yourself and what is important for you. So I would say a lot of change on space geography, question mark about time, and also about the value for the future that will be dominant or not.
Thank you very much. Shada, where would you like to start? From values, where Philippe ended, or from elsewhere?
Yeah, no, I'd like to start, actually start where Philippe finished. I wish I had had more time to do yoga. Unfortunately, I spent a lot of time on online Zoom meetings and, you know, creating new initiatives for Friends of Europe. So a lot of time was spent really working, so I didn't get the time, but I did take long walks. And I have to say, the rediscovery of nature. I live near the Bois de la Combe, and it has been absolutely magnificent. So, László, this has been a big disruption, and I hope that it is also a big reset. And to take forward what Philippe and Lodewijk have been saying, let me just say seven quick points. So what has been, I think, very heartening and I think encouraging for humanity really is this focus on essential workers. We realize that it's the people who are the health workers, but those who are stashing our shelves, those who are driving our trams, the metros, etc., keeping our economy moving, keeping the machine well oiled, how important they are. And it's not the bankers and it's not people like me who are really essential in times of a health crisis like this. So I think this is a discovery of humanity and of what is really essential in our world today, and medical experts, of course. So, you know, you go out at 8 o'clock and you clap, you applaud, you sing, and you're really doing it for everyone who's been there risking their lives and often, you know, also falling sick. So I think it's been a very reassuring moment of solidarity and a recognition of who really, really matters in our world today. The second point is we've also discovered, and I hope I can elaborate a bit further on this, we've discovered the value of our migrant workers, of the refugees that have been often marginalized, often set to the sidelines and attacked by populists and the rest of it. But we've discovered how important they are, not just as health workers and drivers of trams, etc., but also picking fruit, harvesting, you know, so skilled and unskilled. And I hope that that recognition, that changed narrative about migration continues in this post-COVID period. Also, the importance of digital, and Philippe talked about it, teleworking, but also understanding that a lot of the world doesn't have that access. So we are privileged, our children are privileged, our workers are privileged. I've been working from home, no problem, but this is not the case. Even inside Europe, many people don't have access to computers and iPads, just the way many of us do. And of course, in many parts of the world, that is not the case. So when you have a lockdown in India or Pakistan or Iran or in Africa, children are actually not being educated. And you know, their informal economy, which is basically a lot women and you know, daily wage earners, they don't have that access to a basic income or to furlough that many of our governments, thanks to the fiscal space that we talked about earlier, have given us in Europe. I have to say the importance of cities, and Philippe talked about that as well. I think this has been very important, how our cities have been very agile, our mayors have been very agile in adapting and continuing to adapt to a post-COVID environment. And less consumption. I think you're right, Philippe. There isn't this revenge spending. I think we're going to do a lot of e-commerce. We will be buying a lot online and perhaps really not going out to restaurants the way we did. So I think there will be less spending, and our governments will have to realize that as they look at a recovery, hopefully a sustained and green recovery.
Thank you very much. Lodewijk was very brief at the beginning. Would you like to respond to either of the two other panelists?
Well, I think both of them make a very, very important point of the way society now looks at certain aspects of normal life. Just to name two, tourism, which has been such an engine for growth, but also such a danger to cities and living in a peaceful way. In my city, Amsterdam, is a very old medieval city heart, and I went with my son to walk there to see it for the first time the way it was. So that's, I agree that there's less consumption and it takes away the massive transportation of people. But the other side, and I think that's the point mentioned by Hadid, is that the price is being paid by a lot of people who are working in those sectors with 0-hour contracts, with flexible contracts. They were working in tourism, they were working in restaurants, they were working in some of the engines of our economy. So you see two things. You see applauding for some of the vital professions. And if we are not very careful, they will become underpaid again once the crisis is over. And second, a lot of people who are working, making a decent living in those industries that are affected. So we have to be very careful, not just, to enjoy the fact that we're consuming less and making nice walks. I have the same experience. But we need to realize that there's a lot of people, you know, getting unemployed as a result of that. So I think those changes might just as well be permanent, but they raise the obligation for progressive thinkers and politicians to come up with solutions for those people and not look away from their suffering right now. So that maybe as a short response.
Yes, thank you very much. At this point, I would like to invite our audience to send questions, just like in the first part of the discussion with the economists. The Q&A box is open to questions, so please use this opportunity. But then I would turn to the second round of the discussion. Maybe this time we should start with Philippe. Because the idea is to divide the specific aspects of this post-COVID world. I would like to ask Philippe to discuss employment and labor conditions, how these have been affected and what should we expect. Shada Islam about migration, which you already mentioned, but maybe you could elaborate further about how foreign policy, geopolitics and migration would change, and then we come back to Lodewijk Asscher to discuss the impact on democracy and politics, if that's okay.
Yeah, perhaps to continue the debate about the essential worker, and I think that's was a really important change. But in the same time, I had the impression that all the newspaper, the TV, when they spoke about the lockdown, were speaking about we are from Brussels, from the people from the south of Brussels and not from the north of Brussels. So this kind of, okay, we praise them, but we don't pay so much attention of their real daily life, and we don't go where they are living, what they are doing, and in overcrowded apartments, in bad street situation, etc. So I think also that's nice to applaud, but it's also that we have to take that much more seriously, the inequality, and the people continue to work and some to die because of the virus. On the employment and labor condition, I would like to distinguish the two. For the employment is the first one that we don't know is what will be the level, and the classical answer from the Commission and the economists is, okay, we have a fall of GDP, and next year perhaps 6% of growth, and we should return to more or less the same level of employment. Because now we have a sectoral change. If the city are changing, if there is more and more place that you cannot enter with a car, or you have to go slow, and you will be slower than going walking or by why you will buy a car. You will not, and that's a lot of people living in the city. So if you don't buy a car, it's not like the coal industry, because it's a small proportion of the population. In Europe, 400,000 is 8 million people depending on the car industry. So if you have a change in the sector, even we move to electric car, but we will move to less electric car. That will be a huge change, and that we have to take that in consideration much more than the transition. So the green transition could create also some additional job, but I think that we have to return to the basic of the left, and to speak about reduction of working time. Reduction of working time, I don't see how you can change the situation in the car industry without speaking about the reduction of the working time. It's clearly something from the left, and was used by Volkswagen and other company when they had the crisis 10 or 20 years ago. So we have to rethink the working time and to push on the working time. And that I think for me on the employment question will be divide between the one saying return to normal and work more, and the one to say no, there is another path. And then I return to what I said, the value, what is the value, you mentioned to work and to listen to the bird or to the nature, and what will be our conception of time. The second point is about the labor condition and working condition. And there is really interesting because there is no discussion. If you see what is missing in the program of the Commission, there is nothing about health and safety at work, nothing. Don't pay attention about the real life of the worker in the plant. And then I think that's also an opportunity to return to democracy at work and the question of workers' participation. And it's much more this crisis to say, okay, we will be nice to have this disinfectant and mask for free in the working place. I think that should be, for the left also, and the Green, to rethink what are the key challenge of democracy at work. So that's, I would say, for the future, this will be a big question, a difficult question, certainly on employment. But let's have a program about democracy at work and about working.
Thank you very much. So health and safety is at risk, but what else is at risk? Is it also multilateralism or globalism?
So, László, let me start with the question of migration, and I referred to it earlier. You know, the European, let's say, narrative has been so toxic about migration and refugees, and we've seen this, you know, with the detention centers and even governments not being ready to take unaccompanied minors. They had to be forced to do so. So it's been a very toxic environment, and not just because of the far right, and also not just because of authoritarians, but also because mainstream political parties, including many of the parties that are really doing you know, well in Europe, have embraced the far right rhetoric, maybe far right light, but they've actually embraced and adopted much of the anti-migrant, anti-foreigner rhetoric. And so when I see now that the Joint Research Center of the EU has come out with a very powerful study that very few people have actually referred to, but European Affairs Commissioner, Home Affairs Commissioner Ylva Johansson had an interview with me at the Friends of Europe and pointed out that we've seen during this pandemic crisis just how essential our migrant and refugee population and communities are. And many governments across Europe have been fast-tracking qualifications and bringing people into the, you know, medical sector, but also as farmers and workers, etc. Fast-tracking what has been very slow in the past. At the same time, you've seen governments slowing down asylum applications. So it's been a kind of a mixed bag, really. But I'm hoping that politicians like yourselves and you know, the parties that are, let's say, progressive and looking at the future will realize that Europe depends. I mean, the economy we've been talking about, the economy depends on migrant workers. Now, Philippe and Lodewijk have pointed out that there will be unemployment. I mean, obviously, and therefore the populist pressures to go back to the way they were, and we see it already in Britain, you know, where the visas, etc., for National Health Service workers that was so essential, they're being tightened already. So we really need to up our game and to look at the future, the bigger picture, and not retrench into our small-minded, you know, toxic narratives on multilateralism and globalization. Look, I'm hoping that this will survive. Globalization has to be better managed. I think it's crippled at the moment, but we really need to better manage it. Now, global supply chains, there's a lot of talk about reshoring certain sectors. Global supply chains, if you look into it in detail, cannot just be brought back immediately, you know, and some shouldn't be brought back because there is comparative and competitive advantage that has to be there. But we can make sure that we're not overly reliant on the Indias and the Chinas of this world. We can make sure that our global supply chains, our regional supply chains are clean and green, and that certain standards are complied with. So that is important as well, that we don't denounce globalization because it has brought many people into, let's say, a richer life, especially in developing countries, but also our consumers. We're used to globalization, but let's manage it better, and I hope that we can do so. Now, the geopolitics, and there, if I may just go back for a second, I think the European Union has a very important role to play because we are children of multilateralism. That is what the EU is all about. Geopolitics, I mean, really, it's been really toxic as well, poisonous, really. We've had blame games, the great power competition. We've had all kinds of disinformation campaigns, not just from one source, but several sources. So I'm a bit in despair. Now, geopolitics was already in a rather nasty state because of US-China brawling and quarrels over trade and technology. So the environment, the landscape for any kind of, let's say, cooperative competition rather than confrontational competition isn't really there. And once again, I would hope that the European Union, and it has been making some statements to that extent, that we will work together, find partners like-minded and not like-minded, because in this world today we have to have inclusive globalization, inclusive multilateralism. West Europe and America don't call the shots anymore, don't call all the shots anymore. So we will have to work with all kinds of other countries with different ideologies, because there's one humanity, there's one world, and we cannot just work on the basis of our mindsets of the 20th century. We have to move into the 21st century. So I'll come back to that when we talk about the different scenarios, but I'm really, really hoping that we can all work together and make sure that the European Union doesn't forget its obligations and doesn't get sucked into this binary choice between the US and China.
Yes, absolutely. And then we come to Lodewijk Asscher, who would speak about the risks to democracy, rule of law, which is definitely not only an issue outside Europe, but to some extent also in some European countries, isn't it?
Absolutely. So we have had during this pandemic also what we call authoritarian creep. So countries in our midst, our member states, have used this pandemic as a kind of smokescreen to clamp down even harder on the opposition, on the media, on judges, on the rule of law. And we are still, I'd say, slow in reacting to that. And I think our own reputation worldwide, László, depends on what we do at home. So we have to practice what we preach at home to be able to stand up tall on the global stage.
Indeed, thank you. Lodewijk Asscher is next.
Yeah, well, maybe on that final point Shada made, I think that's a very important one. But in all honesty, I think even before the corona crisis, we saw that liberal democracy was under quite a lot of pressure in many countries, also within our European Union. And that has to do with the fact that many voters feel left out, feel that there's no real possibility for change being offered, and that they feel that over the past couple of decades, they have not really benefited from the economic growth that we have seen. Their contracts have become more flexible. They've seen that stock prices went up and their wages didn't. So that was already the situation. And that's why I think if you look at the current situation, there's really two scenarios. If we rush back to normal, normal being the way it was before the corona crisis, we will end up with a society which is more unjust, more unequal, and also which is more vulnerable to fall for the populist temptation. Because then people will say, well, okay, I kept on working, I kept society afloat during those difficult hours and days and months. I took personal risks. I belong to a group that was more affected. And what do I get in return? Austerity, big corporations benefiting, and us paying the price. And I think the main message is that for us as progressives, this is a moment to step up, to build on an agenda which is built on solidarity. We have to look at inequality as another kind of dangerous virus. We don't have the perfect medicine against it, but we do know that we can deal with it. Societies are able to change. I've seen, and it's not a surprise that our authoritarian leaders will use every opportunity to clamp down on opposition. And it's not a surprise that Russia will use this situation to make sure that there's even more unrest and despair. But I think the main lesson is for us, be it scholars, thinkers, or politicians or policymakers, that this is the moment to address not just the corona crisis as a health crisis, but also the economic crisis, also the climate crisis, also the social crisis, and make sure that we deliver on real progress for people. Because if that's not the narrative we're offering, we will almost push back and push people into falling for the populist trap. And I think it's possible now, because we also come from a time where there was almost a religious belief in small government and neoliberal way of looking at things. The markets will solve our problems. And now all of a sudden, not only Europe, but big parts of the world had to rely on government. the sheer power of government to take strict measures, but also to uphold the economy, to pay wages, to close borders if necessary and open them again, build air bridges with protective stuff. So we've seen that governments can be a very strong thing, used to the benefit, but also to do bad things. And second, we were told that change is always incremental. We have to accept small steps and wait a while. And, you know, you have to just accept things as if they were given as a force of nature. But globalization can be changed. The way wealth is distributed can be changed. The way we organize our society can be changed because it was changed overnight. So therefore, us politicians need to offer our narrative for change and be more ambitious, more bold than we might have been before Corona. Because I think that's not only the only way to safeguard our societies, but also to protect democracy, to offer a real choice between, say, the neoliberal conservative consensus, which will, as soon as the crisis is over, stop applauding and start cutting budgets again. The populist trap, say, well, it's always the fault of migrants, Jews, Brussels, you know, name it what you want to name, or another alternative, and we should be offering that alternative.
I think this point is excellent for me to close this round, but also start the next one, because in the next one, we would need to speak about the scenarios. And if we speak about scenarios, it probably means that we don't assume that there is only one way forward. We don't assume that it's actually the virus which determines our future, because the choice between the scenarios is going to be the choice by politics, the choice by our societies, the choice by our governments. Maybe I should invite Shada Islam, who wrote about 3 scenarios, and then we would go to Philippe, who wrote about 4 scenarios, and they figure out what the difference is, and then come back to Lodewijk Asscher.
So the first scenario that I painted was really at the start of the COVID crisis, when we saw the disarray and the disjointed sort of reactions from our own member states, you know, border closures, hoarding of PPEs, and also restriction of sharing exports. So we had some rather, I would say, really disappointing reactions. Now, you can argue that, of course, health is a national priority, national competence, and so countries were authorized and entitled to do that, and that's true. But what was really, I think, missing was transparency and coordination. And you had EU institutions, Brussels, which was really missing in action. So the voice of Brussels was very, very quiet. And if that had continued, and it hasn't, gratefully and thankfully, it hasn't continued in that downward sliding slope. It hasn't been slippery slope. It hasn't been that. And so we've avoided, if you like, we've really avoided the most dismal scenario, which was, you know, an unraveling of sorts of the European Union and a return to national borders, etc. So the second scenario that I painted was also one of a muddle through. Now, often it's said that the EU grows in moments of crisis, but in the muddle through scenario, I didn't see growth. I saw just the same reactions coming back. And if I may say so, you see that a little bit now when you look at the debate that our friends were talking about earlier, you know, the frugal 4 and the others, and, you know, the same divisions and very hurtful language being used by member states against each other. So that muddled through. And look at Brexit. I mean, Brexit is now back on the table, and you would imagine that nothing's changed, that we haven't had, you know, 3 months of lockdowns and our economies are not near collapse, and we really need to work together. But, you know, politicians, I'm sorry to be rather crude about this, are sometimes extremely irresponsible. So the muddle through scenario, I think at the moment is a danger, though I see hopes coming from France and Germany, especially Germany, which seems to be, you know, revising its traditional outlook and traditional approach on fiscal issues. And I think that's very encouraging. We also see the European Commission coming back with some new ideas, the recovery fund. So they're bold ideas coming forward. But I have a feeling that some of the old attitudes, good governance, lack of good governance attitudes are still persisting. And I hope that we can see an end to that. The third scenario is, of course, the optimal, the best scenario, where governments actually show the kind of spirit and solidarity that we always believed Europe has, and which is an inspiration, really, in good times to the rest of the world, where we can move around freely, we can live, marry, work wherever we want. So I'm really hoping that that will come back. But in the meantime, let's not forget that there is a world outside Europe as well. At the moment, we're all looking inward. And my ideal scenario also is that Europe starts looking also at what's happening to the rest of the world, not just Africa, but also poor countries in Asia and Latin America. And there I'm hoping that we can have a more general debt relief package, because these countries are really, really on their knees, and they're all asking for debt relief. So I hope the European Union can actually lead the global solidarity effort. I hope the EU can lead on the search, the hunt for a new vaccine. And once we do find it, makes it accessible to everyone and not just for the rich of the world or the rich of even the developing countries. I'm hoping that health partnerships, now we've seen how austerity that Lodewijk talked about, austerity has actually destroyed some of our basic health infrastructure across the world. And I hope that health partnerships can come back. And finally, I'll say a couple of let's say controversial points. I think in terms of multilateralism, if the European Union were to say enough of the G7, you know, at the moment we're talking about having a G7 perhaps in September, perhaps not, but I think it's enough now. G7 is a relic of the past. I've just written a paper on it, and we need to move beyond. I think the G20, the EU should take a role in reviving the G20. And finally, I've also talked about a Bretton Woods moment, another Bretton Woods moment, where wise leaders, and I hope the EU leadership is among those wise leaders, comes together and says, look, we've had a crisis, and I totally agree with Lodewijk, you know, unemployment and all these issues are going to be so deeply entrenched. We'll have to think new ways of creating jobs. Comes together and has an innovative moment where we decide to restructure our old-fashioned, out-of-date multilateral organizations. So I'm very hopeful that there are these kernels of new ideas among people, the progressives, as we said. What we need to do is up our game and to communicate this to people, because I believe, László, I believe people are ready for change. I think people are really, really ready for good governance, good communication, and good ideas. This is the moment to do it.
Thank you very much. Philippe Pochet, I'm sure muddling through is not your preferred scenario either.
Certainly not. I had, as you said, four scenario, and the first one is kind of the return of the neoliberal order. And at the beginning, I put that this scenario as really assumption with zero change or very little change, but more and more I have my doubt. I don't say it's the most probable, not at all, but still I would put it's at 10% now, because you see, and you can see in the US, but also part of the employers returning to the old blah, 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 and wanting to do that. And that's very clear. It will not be in the next 2 years, because the pressure is too much, and with all the COVID. But in 2-3 years, we cannot really be sure it will not be returned when we have this amount of debt. And what I think it's what's important, what the previous speaker said in the previous webinar, is at European level is a paradigm change, but not a game change. And that thing is very important, because a paradigm change, we saw it all of us in 2008 and 2009, we had also a paradigm change to the green relaunch of the economy, and it was not the case. The second one is the return to the consumption, the Keynesian stuff, and kind of consumption of the end of the world. So there is no future when not to buy an expensive bottle of champagne. That's in a way. And this scenario, I think that supports a classic scenario of growth. There is a risk in the scenario if it doesn't work, because it doesn't work once, it doesn't work twice, and then we will return in 5-6 years to say, okay, let's deregulate the market, because this scenario is much more a regulate, classical left scenario. But if it doesn't work, I think they will say, okay, but it's because there is not too many protection to the worker. The third one is the authoritarian. I think the authoritarian, for me, mix three things. Mix the protection, I protect you, put clearly the others, against the other, but also use the technology. And that's the China example, because it's not, I think Poland and Hungary are not really interesting for this case. It's China. When you have 5G, in 5G you control the citizen, and that's the goal also of the 5G. So I think you can have this kind of more authoritarian if the COVID doesn't stop, if there is no vaccine. People say, okay, I want to be protected, and the states say, look to the app, we will control you. If you want to be protected, we will control you. And I think it's a really risky scenario where perhaps we should pay a little bit more attention, including to what are the conditions that we are developing the 5G and the protection of all civil and human rights. And finally, it's the kind of the great transformation, and we return to green and all is nice. As already said, we will have a problem with unemployment, and we have to return to the question of working time. But there is also a question that, and that's a difficult one, at least for me, perhaps I'm wrong, but it's also a kind of regional. We return to local, we return to region, and we use, and what is the difference about who is the other with the authoritarian scenario? We have to clearly define in this scenario, the other is not the foreigner, it's not the next village, it's not the next region, which could be in trying to recapture the control of the local, because what is the local? And I think in this scenario, we have really to think what is kind of open regionalization, what is the possibility to have a cooperation at global level, and to have the same goal that we will do that differently, perhaps at local level. Because if we don't have that clear, I think there is only a thin line between this scenario and the authoritarian scenario. And there is a real risk that defining the others will be very negative. And all we saw in Europe, how easy it was to close the border and to say, okay, I fear no, I'm Estonian, I fear the Latvian, I think the Finnish, I think the Italian. And all that was done in few hours, that you say the other European is no longer part of the same project, it's different. And I think that's the fourth scenario, but that's clearly the one I would support.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Lodewijk, tell us about your own vision and your own essay.
Thank you, László. I think the scenarios both former speakers mentioned are unfortunately quite realistic. So there are serious dangers now. However, I'm a bit more optimistic about the European response. I think, as it always goes, there's a big fight first. But if you look at the Merkel-Macron proposal and the European Commission proposal, I can see where this might be going. And I think that's better than just muddling through. Because there's talk about, I think, a serious recovery fund with also a good combination of not only tackling this economic crisis, but also the climate crisis. And maybe also, you know, enabling industries and businesses to adapt faster than they would otherwise have done. However, I think that it's necessary to make a clear choice within Europe for cooperation and solidarity. And in my country, I'm part of the Frugal Four country, the Netherlands, even though not everybody in the Netherlands is thinking the same on everything, which is a good part of democracy. But I think this requires responsible behavior in my country and in other countries to have a real talk about how we work together in Europe and how we can help each other in a grown-up kind of way. I always look at Brexit as an accident that could only happen because of neglecting the discourse on the relationship between the UK and Europe for too many years. And then people, you know, get their thoughts stuck in one direction, and they might even vote against their own interest, as I believe they've done for Brexit. And that's why I think this is a crucial moment. And in my essay, I try to describe how we could, you know, once again, stress the things we have in common. And I think if you look at it from the perspective of workers, I really like what was being said about working conditions, healthy working conditions. This is part of the job Europe has. László, you held that portfolio. You know how important it is that Europe as a rule maker protects workers in each and every country, in each and every business. If you look at it from the perspective of European workers, there's a possibility for a common agenda here, and that should be the scenario where you can just show that recovery funds are not going to the stockholders or the big corporations that are dodging taxes, or big American companies that are benefiting from us zooming all the time, but directly into the wages of people working, be it in the Netherlands or in Spain or in Greece or wherever in Europe. I think the European Commission has touched on this aspect, but they can be much more vocal about their political view on where this money should be spent and why. So I think back to normal would mean going backwards. I think the new future that can be created for Europe has to be based on a much more social Europe, upward social convergence as a prerequisite for any European measure that is being taken. And I think, and this is something I agree with Shada with, there's a lot of support for that amongst voters that might be turned into Eurosceptics or Europhobics if the language coming from Brussels is too much part of the neoliberal order. But it could be Euro enthusiasts if they see that they are actually protected against authoritarianism, against big corporations, against unhealthy working conditions.
Thank you very much. In the meantime, much of the reading list already appeared in the chat box. So those who are interested in reading the 3 essays can just click on the links. I know that Lodewijk Asscher would need to leave around 2 o'clock. So maybe we start the Q&A round with you. And I thought that there is one very interesting, which also mentioned the tourists, as you did, from Amsterdam, noticing that the COVID crisis means less tourists, less business, and less consumption, at least for a while, of which a lot of people see some benefits, but also would like to restore the level of incomes. Is there a way to square this circle somehow to have less consumption and let's say the unwelcome tourists, but maintaining or even restoring good work incomes?
It's not an easy one to square this circle, but I think there are several solutions. First of all, in the Netherlands, we've seen a lack of people working in education or in healthcare. That's been growing. So there's an enormous demand, and there's not enough people, applying for jobs in the public sector. And one of the lessons this crisis teaches us is that we desperately need them to educate our children and to provide care for all of us, especially our more vulnerable citizens. So one solution should be to retrain and bring people to new jobs, but not from unemployment benefits situation. You want them to go from one job to another, because we all know, and this was once again proven in the 2008 crisis, that once people are out of work and in a benefit situation, it's so much harder for them to integrate in the labor market again. Second, I think when it comes to tourism, I think in all honesty, the way tourism has become a huge factor has shown some clear disadvantages, not only in Amsterdam, but in all tourist hotspots. So this is something where you need a gradual change. So we should not just use the shock, but there has to be a gradual change, and tourism will return. I'm convinced of that, but maybe not in the shape and in the numbers and the sheer mass consumption style, which was, in all honesty, quite often not adding so much value, not leading to so much worthwhile consumption. Was more or less low cost carriers paying shitty wages to their workers, shipping lots of people around the world. And if we can make sure that this is changed into a more sustainable kind of tourism where local companies and local providers get a bigger stake of what is consumed, then you could actually have a lot of more quality jobs in that sector, and not only in my country, but I think in most hotspots. And that's change that is necessary, but maybe this crisis can be used to speed up the change. And third, I think it was mentioned in the first round, the fact that there's a change towards walking, bicycling, and instead of cars and buses taking all public spaces, that also opens up opportunity for a new city life with new city jobs within it.
Thank you very much. I'm reading the available questions. Interestingly, our panelists were reading the mind of the audience, because there is, for example, a question from Agnes Huber about the possibilities of the 4-day week based on the announcement of the New Zealand Prime Minister. I think Philippe Pochet was already connecting with this when he suggested that the reduction of the working time could be considered, but maybe we follow up this question with another one from Agnes Huber, who was also asking the same, the previous one, about the value of work. Is this a good momentum or a good situation to promote further equal pay for equal value?
Who are you pointing the question to, László?
Well, I wonder, maybe Philippe could be the one to start, and then you or Shada Islam can also follow up.
Yes, if I can do some advertising, we will have at the ETUI the next webinar, the 12th is about working time and discussion on working time. But I want to return to this question of equal pay and equality between men and women, because we are here to have a kind of nice, the nice part of the story. But if we see equality between men and women, there were very little during the crisis. And when you had a survey, who is taking care about the task at home, 40% of the men said we did some progress, and was shared only by 3% of the women, which gave also a kind of sense that it's not working perhaps in the right direction. And we had the same showing that the women scholar academic were publishing much less during the crisis than the men. So I think that's the crisis should have perhaps be an opportunity to return to equality between men and women, but in reality seems not to have such positive impact. And I think that's really important when we will go out of the crisis, that this question should be at the center of the agenda. And you know, that's the question of transparency, which is on the table of the Commission. But still, that's kind of, if you look at it in perspective, which was the first social policy of the EU and the European Commission, more than 40 years ago, 50 years ago, the friend still there is a lot to do. So I think that's Agnes is perfectly right. That's something that we have to put clearly on the table. And I will just link that to the other policy, health and safety and equality between men and women, were the two first policy. We have to return to them. We have to achieve what was not fully achieved the last 4 decades.
There are two colleagues in the audience, Martin Schmalzried and Willy de Backer, both of them asking about degrowth. And I think this is probably on the mind of many others as well. One of them more in the context of not restoring the previous level of consumption and whether this is so bad or not. But I think there is another aspect of this, to the extent in the past, not only decade, but decades, in a way, China and other booming emerging economies were the centers of economic growth. And given the recent developments, I think we can also ask the question, what happens if this is not coming back? That China would, in the same way as in the past quarter of century, drive economic growth also for the rest of the world. So there is a lifestyle aspect of this. I wonder I wonder if perhaps Lodewijk would want to connect with that, or the geopolitical aspect of not having so much growth in the world, and especially not the same way from China.
Do you want me to start, or I think Lodewijk has to leave, so maybe you go first.
Maybe just a few words. You could hear a bell ringing here, which means that we're summoned to go to our parliament now, which is in session today. So unfortunately, I have to leave this very interesting discussion, but I'd like to thank you all and also for chairing it. Maybe just 2 words on the geopolitical level. I think this crisis shows here that not only there's this interdependency, but also that a lack of American leadership which was discussed and talked about over the past couple of years, and which is not just Trump. Under Obama, you could see the United States retracting from the old positions, but that gives us a very clear obligation to step up. You know, if the United States no longer is the leader of the free world, we do need someone to be leader of the free world, and I think it has to be us in Europe, and that means also unpopular things among progressives, military spending, being more assertive in our relationship towards China, not just waiting for the US to solve our problems, changing globalization. I agree with Shada there. It's not a matter of saying you're for or against it. You need to be able to change it in a way that it is more socially acceptable. But it starts with the ambition to take that leadership role, because we just desperately need that. So with those words, I'm very sorry I have to say goodbye to you, and looking forward to further discussions. And thank you so much for hosting this.
Thank you so much for coming, and also for your essay. See you next time.
See you next time.
So if I could just take up from where Lodewijk has finished. Yes, European Union, the EU can be a leader, but Europe can't do it alone. And I believe very much that if we are going to have a quick recovery and a sustainable and a green recovery, Europe will have to work with like-minded countries, but also unlike-minded countries. It will be issue-driven leadership. So on climate change, for instance, Europe can work with China and with India. On technology, it can work with South Korea, with Taiwan. And I think this is the way forward. We're going to have to break away from the feeling and the overarching sort of practice that we've had so far within the WTO, etc., where everyone comes together and it's multilateralism taken to the extreme. This is not going to be the case, László. We'll have to work on the basis of plurilateral agreements to take our recovery path more urgently, if you like. And on China, this is the first time that at the recent mega meeting that was held in Beijing just a few days ago, first time in many decades that China has not set, the government, Xi Jinping has not set a growth target, a specific growth target for China. Now, this is very, very important because it means that China is putting a lot of focus on the quality of growth and stability. And it's not going to be on consumer spending and investments as in the past. Now, this is a picture, this is a story that we'll have to follow very carefully. And we'll have to work out how much that means, what that means for our investments and for our exports. China, in the eyes of many experts, is actually embarked on its own decoupling policy vis-a-vis the West. And, you know, so we have to take that into account. But I am heartened by the fact that borders and restrictions are not being imposed immediately. I think people will be very, very careful before they embark on an economic nationalist route that many are tempted by. But this interdependence that we've seen in the area of pharmaceuticals, in the area of PPEs, shows that we cannot really ever be self-sufficient. So we'll have to work together. And I'm hoping also that we'll see some movement on issues to do with migration of health workers, quick visas for health workers. This is something that India has been asking for a very long time. So I sincerely believe that this is a moment where we can actually, as progressives, innovate, have big ideas, questions to do with basic income, with cash transfers, shorter working weeks, also equal opportunities for equal work, not just between men and women, but also between sectors. You know, we realize that these essential workers that we are applauding every day are the worst paid. As I think Philippe said, you know, they are the gig economy. They're absolutely living in precarious situation. We have to find a way, and this is the moment to find a way where we can actually stop this inequality between sectors, where the bankers are being paid bonuses and airline, you know, proprietors or huge airlines are getting bailouts, where the staff is being made redundant. There's something absolutely wrong. And I think people, the younger generation, I think of my own children, they're not ready for that. They're going to be judging companies on the basis of how they behave in a crisis. So those who are actually being good to their workers are going to be the ones that come out with their heads held high and be able to sort of work and make money in the future.
Thank you very much. There is a very last question which I would like to ask from both of you actually. Maybe you would both comment in 2 minutes. This is about a conference which was already put forward 1 year ago, the so-called Conference on the Future of Europe. And needless to say, because of the COVID crisis, this has suffered a delay. But I think it's not only a delay, but certainly this conference will have to be different after the COVID crisis. What would you suggest are the most important points this conference on the future of Europe would need to integrate from the COVID crisis response or the COVID crisis lessons, how to reshape the European Union in this new situation, perhaps even pointing towards a new treaty. Your opinion. Maybe first Philippe and then Shada.
Yeah, I think that's the, for me, there is one issue is about climate change. In all this time we are able to deal with. So if we are speaking about the future of Europe or future of humanity, and Shada was speaking about what is happening in China, that's the way, and I'm rather positive with the plan of the Commission so far, that we have to clearly have the breakthrough. And we had the discourse in 2010, it failed. We had the discourse in 2000, it failed. We had the discourse 10 years before, in the last century, it failed. And I think that's really the line. And as I said, it will be very difficult. It will be that we have to get the perspective that people can embark and need to have to rethink what will be the conversation and what is the form of governance. Because for that, we have to speak, and you also allude to that, to different people. We cannot say we are right and we are 30%. We have to rethink how we can, in that conversation, do that in a way that this time is the right one and not another lost opportunity. And we are able to embark everyone or almost everyone in this conversation. And I think that for the future of Europe, no, that's for me the main issue, which is very difficult if you take that seriously, because to have nice discourse is very easy. Everyone can do that.
Mm-hmm. Shada Islam?
So, I mean, the thing is, László, the future of Europe, it was, as you said, in another, it's almost like another lifetime, you know, when we were talking about a conference and we would talk about different, about governance and, you know, Spitzenkandidaten and all that. And it just seems so irrelevant now, you know, we're in the midst of a crisis, and our eyes and our hands have to be on the recovery for all the different reasons that we've talked about. So I think I would put the focus on good governance. I would really make it about leadership. European leadership in times of crisis, because this is going to be, everyone is telling us that the pandemic is not going to go away. We'll have other pandemics. So clearly we'll have to talk about leadership in times of crisis. Who does what? How do we coordinate? And rather than having this rather disappointing disarray among member states, which everyone is looking at, and how many times have I been asked, is Europe unraveling? And I have to say, no, not yet. It won't. But this is the image we're giving to the rest of the world. We are an inspiration for many countries, and I think we need to keep it that way. I think health will absolutely have to be top of the agenda. Of course, national competence can't be taken away, but we'll have to pool some of our resources into some areas that have to do with health, including migration, as I talked about earlier. Digital is going to be the key issue, and there we're talking ethics, we're talking GDPR, we're talking facial recognition, we're talking about how the deontology of our digital world is going to, we'll have to set standards, and I think there the European Commission is doing well with Facebook and Twitter and others, but I think that will have to be top of the agenda. And then finally, equality, getting rid of the inequalities. Men, women, migrants, citizens, north, south, rich, poor, generational conflicts that we've been faced with, which I find also extremely disheartening in this pandemic. Generations are being pit by politicians against each other. So I think these are the kinds of, if I may say, societal issues, economic societal issues, and some cultural issues, which will have to take top priority. Are our leaders ready for that? Are they not too entrenched in their silos? Are they ready to think, horizontally rather than vertically? I leave that up to you to decide, but I hope so.
Well, unfortunately, we cannot jump into that discussion right now, but it was a very fascinating list of issues which we had about the connection between the COVID crisis and the future of the European Union. But this is the end of this double webinar between FEPS and ETUI. I thank everybody for coming today. For the panelists, Shada, Philippe, Pochet, and Lodewijk, Asscher, who already had to leave, and also those who participated in the first round of this discussion. I thank the audience, also especially for those who sent questions or just tweeted. Tweeting is possible also afterwards. And finally, I should draw the attention of those who are still with me to various publications. Philippe already mentioned some of the publications and forthcoming events of ETUI. Let me also highlight that some of the previous events and also the forthcoming ones of FEPS in this web age have been put online, so can be watched again. And we have also launched a series which we call the FEPS COVID response papers. And these cover various aspects of the current crisis, from social questions to the economic policy. And in fact, one paper whose authors participated in the first panel, Paul Magnette, Peter Bofinger, together with other distinguished authors like Michael Landesman and Andrew Watt, have produced one which is forthcoming shortly about the economic policy of the recovery. So please stay tuned to the organizers and the panelists of this discussion. And thank you for your attention today. I thank also the organizers from our respective teams from ETUI and FEPS who have not been visible on the screen today, but they were working hard in the back office to make this possible. Thanks a lot and see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.